So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. I think I'll introduce both of them, first of all, so then we won't have so much of a gap between. So first, Dr. Thana de Campos did her DPhil in Oxford, which was published as The Global Health Crisis, Ethical Responsibilities by Cambridge University Press in 2017. She's an assistant professor of law, ethics, and global public policy at the Pontifical Catholic University in Chile, and is also a research fellow of the von Hugel Institute in Cambridge. She's currently a Fung Global Fellow at Princeton's Institute for International and Regional Studies, and also as a research fellow of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights. She directs the Dignity and Equity in Women's Health Issues research program. And to respond, Dr. Xavier Symons is a postdoctoral research fellow at Australia Catholic University's Plunkett Centre for Ethics. His research interests include ethical issues at the beginning and end of life, and aged care, the ethics of healthcare rationing, and pandemic ethics. He's recently completed a PhD thesis focused on the allocation of life-saving healthcare resources. He's taught bioethics for several years and is a regular contributor to the Australian media and also to BioEdge, for those who subscribe. In 2020, he was awarded the Fulbright Future Postdoctorate Scholarship, and he will be a scholar in residence at Georgetown University's Kennedy Institute of Ethics from June to December this year. And also last year, he was visiting research fellow of the Anscombe Bioethics Center. So without more ado, I will invite Thana to speak to us on, and I've forgotten the title, so you can tell it. Thank you, Thana.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon. Thank you for this introduction and thank you for having me. I'll try to share my screen with you now. Okay. So yeah, so as Professor Jones said, I am a scholar of international human rights law and global bioethics. My research overall looks at international laws and policies that have a negative impact on the right to health, dignity, and flourishing of the most vulnerable in the world. My most recent book project is looking at the idea of love of neighbor applied to certain global health issues. And one of these issues includes the problem of how to ethically allocate COVID-19 vaccines, not only within, but also among nations. This book project is looking at these problems from a human rights and ethics perspective. And particularly, I am focusing on illnesses that spread across political borders. And I'm looking at how global justice together with global solidarity, or agapic love of neighbor as I'm conceptualizing it, respond to this problem. Justice and global affairs seem naturally to belong to each other, but love and global affairs is an unusual combination. Although love and global affairs do not typically appear together, my book argues that they should. It argues that love, or agapic love of neighbor to be more precise, would change the practice of global affairs in general and the design of global health institutions in particular. So this book project is titled The Rule of Love, Love-Based Governance for Global Health. My book provides first a normative framework of cosmopolitan duties of care, of mutual care. And I premise this framework on feminist theories of mutual vulnerabilities and interdependence among nations and individuals. And second, a conceptual analysis of love of neighbor premised on Martin Luther King's interpretation of agape as a creative force for change. Today, I'll be sharing a chapter of my book with you. So after giving you a brief overview of my book, I'll be speaking about chapter 3. I chose this chapter because it contains the main argument of my book applied to the current controversy of international allocation of COVID-19 vaccines. And the argument is this: Love changed the way we understand global responsibilities of mutual care among nations and among individuals. Although it's typically argued that love requires equality of care, I argue that it doesn't. Instead, it requires equity. Love requires shared yet differentiated duties to care for those in need according to our relationship to the most vulnerable. So love tolerates some partiality in taking care first of those in our own community without abandoning outsiders to their own luck. Chapter 3 explores global responsibilities of mutual care by focusing on the question of allocation of COVID-19 vaccines among countries. This creates an opportunity to engage with global justice theories of cosmopolitanism versus communitarianism, which respond to the question of states' duties to assist countries in need. These theories inform the current controversy between vaccine cosmopolitanism and vaccine nationalism. In contrasting these polarizing views of global justice, I'll show that one way in which love can move things forward in human rights laws and policies is by establishing common ground between these opposing views. Love helps restore union in the international community. In my analysis of the global responsibilities of mutual care among nations and among individuals, Chapter 3 will explore the following questions. What is international cooperation? Why is it a legal duty? And what does it entail in the current COVID-19 vaccines context? And I contend that states have a legal duty to cooperate during a pandemic, as solidarity requires. And while this duty entails an extraterritorial responsibility to care for and assist other nations, as stewardship requires, the legal duty to cooperate also allows states to attend first to the basic needs of those most vulnerable under their own jurisdiction, as subsidiarity requires. Solidarity, stewardship, and subsidiarity are the three principles of love. So the upshot of my conceptual and normative analysis is a principled tripartite account of pandemic governance based on the principles of solidarity, stewardship, and subsidiarity. This tripartite account opens up a new way of theorizing a long-standing debate in the ethics and global affairs literature, namely the moral tension between multilateralism and protectionism, including here the current debate about vaccine nationalism. My principal tripartite account substantiates the idea of global co-responsibilities for international cooperation, not only in the specific context of this pandemic, but also beyond, as an ethic of love of neighbor would justify. So let me give you, as promised, the overview of my book to clarify the key terminologies I'm using. The core concept is, of course, the idea of love, agapic love of neighbor. So I'll start with love and what its three principles entail in the context of global affairs in general and global health governance more specifically. Then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthrights. In the poem, The Hill We Climb, which Amanda Gorman performed during the inauguration of President Biden on January 20th, the word love is linked to the word change. In this way, she echoes, I think, Martin Luther King Jr.'s adaptation of love as a creative force for change. In discussing the role of love in the Black freedom movement in the US, Dr. King talks of agapic love of neighbor, as love in action, the force that creates, preserves, and restores unity in community. In other words, agapic love of neighbor is friendship, a horizontal reciprocal relation where one friend gives himself, his love, his care to the other. Love does not abandon. Love is not indifferent to the suffering of the other. Love is being present, is being there for the other in need. And that presence nurtures a friendship. Friendship is a horizontal relation that occurs not only among individuals, but also among states and institutions. Cicero, the Roman statesman, writes about this on his treatise on friendship. Amicitia, which means friendship, could be between individuals or between states. So states and global institutions, of which we are all part, can stand in friendship with one another. It is in this sense that love here has a truly global dimension. It's universal, cosmopolitan principle, in that it applies across political and geographical borders, but it's also a particular experience lived personally in the cultural context of the individuals and institutions involved. In conceptualizing love as both universal and personal, I'm following here Dr. King's philosophical school of thought of personalism. When Dr. King says that agape is a willingness to go to any length to restore community, he's pointing to a fundamental feature of love. Love is generous. Love gives generously. Love cares for the other, restoring union and community in a generous, creative way. If justice requires us to go the first mile for our neighbor in need, love requires us to go an extra mile. It is in this sense that love transcends the boundaries of justice, of rights, of nationalities, and in justifying a duty of care for those who may not have any rights to claim. Agapic love then justifies a duty of mutual care within a community based on the interdependence of the members in the community and their mutual vulnerabilities. This vocabulary of interdependence, mutual care, and mutual vulnerability has been extensively debated by feminist philosophers of care, and I'm following this philosophical tradition here to argue for a cosmopolitan duty of mutual care among nations and individuals justified by love, agapic love of neighbor. Now, one question about this cosmopolitan duty of care that love requires remains unanswered in this literature of feminist ethics of care applied to global affairs. And the question is this: does the love-based cosmopolitan duty of care that nations have for other nations and that individuals have for other individuals necessitate equality of care and concern for all neighbors, all nations, and all individuals equally, or does love tolerate some partiality? My answer in this book is that cosmopolitan duties of care necessitate equality of respect for the equal worth and dignity of all individuals, but not equality of care. Instead, it requires equity, meaning shared yet differentiated duties of care for those in need according to our role and relationship to them and their need. So some partiality is tolerated or even justified by role-based and community-embedded responsibilities to take care first of one's own, without overlooking our shared responsibilities for all those in need and without abandoning outsiders to their own luck. There are general duties to love and care that fall on everybody, everywhere, as the principle of solidarity requires, but there are also special duties to love and care that fall on specific institutions and specific people because of specific community ties or because of specific capacities, as the principles of subsidiarity and stewardship requires. These three principles, solidarity, subsidiarity, and stewardship, are principles of Catholic social teaching as well as international law, and I present them as principles of love on how to structure love of neighbor in the international community. Taken together, they present a tripartite normative framework of global health governance based on love as the foundational value. And what this account does is to further define how shared yet differentiated responsibilities among global health actors should look like if they were to be grounded on love, where love is, as I conceptualize following Dr. King's adaptation of agape, universal, local, and personal. While solidarity emphasizes the universal cosmopolitan aspects of love, subsidiarity reminds us of the need to respect local communities when discharging the cosmopolitan duty of care for one another. And then stewardship goes further to draw attention to the personal, the specific ways in which love is experienced in concrete relationships of care and trust among real people in different cultural settings. My love-based account of global affairs in general and global health governance in particular seeks to establish a common ground between opposing views of multilateralism and protectionism in the interest of restoring union and community at the international level as an ethic of love of neighbor would justify. I believe that the common ground approach is key in divisive times such as this. The language of love and common ground can, I believe, offer creative ways of moving international human rights laws and policies forward. And this is the task of Chapter 3, to offer a language of love and finding a common ground between vaccine cosmopolitanism and vaccine nationalism. Chapter 3 asks 3 main questions. The first question is, what is international cooperation? Now, if this question is asked to an orthodox international lawyer, he would say, well, if states have a legal duty to cooperate among themselves in suppressing a pandemic, then we need first to identify its legal sources. Here, one would typically refer to Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This article establishes a general duty to cooperate, and for those states that are able, also an extraterritorial obligation to assist other countries. At least this is how the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has interpreted in 2 general comments. The problem is that the legal force of these documents have been questioned. The International Court of Justice, for example, has discredited the legal force of the committee's general comments on at least 2 occasions. In analyzing these 2 occasions, positivists have argued that although there is an agreement on the necessity of international cooperation, it's not possible to rely on the interpretation that the committee provides in their general comments because they are not sufficiently strong legal instruments or sources to create a legal duty. Well, one may respond to this positivist objection by saying that the general comments, together with other legal documents, do reflect state practice. However, the positivists wouldn't be convinced because at least 2 other documents explicitly reject international cooperation and assistance as a legal duty. Hence, it's necessary to address the deeper philosophical premises underlying this position. These 2 documents that reject legal duty to cooperate represent the 2 main pillars of the orthodox view of international law, namely positivism, which is the rejection of the moral foundations of legal duties, and voluntarism, which is the sufficiency of state consent for the existence of legal duties. Positivism and voluntarism are the 2 basic features that Prospel-Vale has classically assigned to international law. The first pillar of the orthodox view affirms the positivist severance of the moral and the legal. In the 2005 document, several states affirmed that they believed that international cooperation and assistance was an important moral obligation, but not a legal entitlement. Moral and legal duties are not synonymous and they shouldn't be conflated. However, it seems that this report makes this conceptual distinction primarily to assert that the duty to cooperate lacks legal validity in international law because it can only be backed up by morality and not by any valid legal instrument. Therefore, in the report's view, although the duty to cooperate could be morally justified, it cannot be legally justified because these countries did not consent to it in a valid legal instrument or other traditional source of international law with legal force. So this is positivism. It predicates legal validity upon positive legal norms or other traditional sources of international law, and with no reference to moral evaluation. Positivism is the first pillar of the orthodox view of international law. The second pillar affirms the voluntarist emphasis on state sovereignty. Similar to the first example, the 2012 document also rejected the existence of a legal duty to cooperate and assist by emphasizing the merely voluntary nature of cooperation. Accordingly, a legal enforcement of such duty would presumably contradict the voluntary nature of cooperation and improperly interfere with state sovereignty. This emphasis on the voluntary nature of international cooperation, coupled with the prominence given to state sovereignty, exemplifies the voluntarist view of international law. Voluntarism holds that that sovereign states are subjects of international law only insofar as they consent to be bound by its legal requirements. So these are the two pillars of the orthodox view. However, it seems that most states and most people would agree that international cooperation and assistance, particularly in the context of a pandemic, is at least desirable and morally justifiable. This was the understanding that several countries recently expressed in the 2020 resolution on global solidarity to fight the coronavirus disease, which reaffirmed their commitment to international cooperation and multilateralism. And it actually included several countries that previously opposed international cooperation as a legal duty. Now, supporters of the orthodox view would here insist that this 2020 resolution has no legal force and has not been consented by several other states. But international law has other ways of establishing and justifying legal duties. Positivist voluntarism is not the only available theory of international law. And other schools of thought, for example, natural law, would establish and justify obligations using other reasons, such as ethical reasons. And this is what the chapter does next by addressing the second question. Why is the duty to cooperate a legal duty? To answer this and to challenge the orthodox view, I'll discuss some of the scholars who have argued against Weil's positivist voluntarist view of international law and provide the moral grounds of the duty to cooperate. And by moral, I mean the conceptual and normative justifications for the duty. The selected moral theories are relevant for my purpose of explaining my account of pandemic governance, predicated on the principles of stewardship, solidarity, and subsidiarity. These three principles taken together justify why states have a legal duty to cooperate during a pandemic, irrespective of their consent, as per solidarity, and why, while this duty entails an extraterritorial obligation to care for and assist other nations, as per stewardship, it also allows states to attend first to the basic needs of the most vulnerable under their own jurisdiction, including vulnerable fellow nationals and residents, as per subsidiarity. Among the opponents of the orthodox view, Credo and Fox-Decent recent theory establishes the moral justification for mandatory multilateralism. They take mandatory to mean that states lack discretion under international law to make public policy decisions unilaterally in relation to matters of global concern. Their theoretical justifications of mandatory multilateral cooperation is based on two organizing principles of international law, namely sovereign equality and joint stewardship. While sovereign equality provides the moral foundations to explain why states are mutually independent in the international legal order, joint stewardship justify why states are also mutually dependent. They point out that this mutual dependence is evident whenever the international legal order needs to regulate and manage a matter of transnational concern, such as a pandemic. By a joint stewardship, Credo and Fox-Decent mean a joint administrative authority shared by all states, where all states have a symmetrical relation of sovereign equality to one another. Joint stewardship, therefore, provides the justification of states' duty to manage global public goods, such as global public health, multilaterally rather than unilaterally on behalf of humanity. I found Credo and Fox-Decent conception of joint stewardship helpful to establish the legal duty to cooperate and assist other nations, but their definition needs at least two clarifications. First, more than merely to manage a global public good, I would add that stewardship justifies care, a duty to take care of humanity's global public goods. As a principle of love, I define stewardship in terms of the duty to care for something or someone entrusted to the steward. The steward is the regulator, the guardian, the leader who has a specific duty of care in its mandate. In this sense, the World Health Organization is a steward as the leader of global health par excellence. And each nation state is also a steward as the guardian of public health of those under their jurisdiction. And all of these global health stakeholders and regulators have a joint stewardship role, which tasks them with the duty to care for the global public health of humanity, while also taking local realities seriously. Second, it's also not clear what the difference between Credo and Fox-Decent conception of joint stewardship and the international law principle of solidarity is. Stewardship and solidarity are not synonymous. I conceptualize stewardship as a regulatory principle, and stewardship justifies when intervening and assisting are reasonable and legitimate acts of care, not only management, but also authentic care leading to integral human development, and when not. In this sense, stewardship further specifies the realities of the principles of solidarity and subsidiarity, as I explain next. Solidarity is a fundamental principle of international law in general, and of international human rights law in particular, and it's also an established principle of Catholic social teaching. Solidarity has the purpose of affirming the human dignity of each and every human life individually, and it also it does so in the reality of our mutual vulnerabilities and interconnectedness, where the global common good of each member of every community is to be upheld. By global common good, I do not mean the maximized welfare for the greatest number, determined by a cost-benefit analysis or a Pareto optimal outcome. Rather, I mean the set of values and reasons that justify collaboration with others in a way that enables the flourishing of all members of the community and is conducive to their integral human development. In this sense, solidarity justifies global co-responsibilities of care among nations and among individuals. The idea of solidarity as mutual trusteeship has been explored by Benvenisti. However, for him, sovereign states as trustees of humanity only have duties of care for other nations in two situations: when bestowing such care is costless according to a Pareto outcome of cost-benefit analysis, or when there is a catastrophe. So Benvenisti's utilitarian definition of solidarity and the kinds of duties of care it justifies is less burdensome than mine. My definition of solidarity in particular, and my tripartite account of pandemic governance in general, would justify extraterritorial obligations to care for and assist outsiders, even when it's costly and when a Pareto optimal outcome cannot be achieved. Upholding the global common good is often costly and can be inefficient, but a non-utilitarian morality, like the ethics of love of neighbor, may so require, whether there is a catastrophe or not. Love requires generosity, not efficiency. So my definition of solidarity justifies extraterritorial obligations to care for and assist outsiders, even when it's costly or inconvenient to do so. Now, while my definition of solidarity justifies universally shared duties of mutual care among nations and individuals, particularly in a pandemic, it does not entail that these duties are homogeneous. To understand how differentiated these duties are, the third principle of love is useful. If solidarity requires that the basic health needs of foreign nationals be taken seriously, one might think that states then should have an equal duty to care for those under their jurisdiction and for outsiders. Perhaps one might even be led to think that the state's duty to care for outsiders should trump the duty to care for locals if outsiders are in a greater and more desperate need. The principle of subsidiarity would suggest differently, though. Originally a Catholic concept, subsidiarity is today a structural principle of international human rights law. It locates the proper level of responsibility and decisional authority among multi-level stakeholders according to a bottom-up approach, that is to say, from local to regional to global. Subsidiarity recognizes the value of first trying to solve problems locally, involving local communities as much as possible, and moving up to higher levels of governance only as necessary. The principle of subsidiarity, therefore, emphasizes the primary responsibilities of local communities for the realization of their human rights. By proposing a bottom-up perspective that allocates duties of care first to local communities and then to higher levels only insofar as the lower level communities need assistance, subsidiarity morally justifies why states are allowed to attend first to the basic needs of those most vulnerable under their own jurisdiction, while also required not to abandon vulnerable outsiders. As Carosa observes, subsidiarity cannot be reduced to a simple devolution of authority to more local levels. So this requirement of non-abandonment justify stringent duties to cooperate with and care for vulnerable outsiders. Now, how do these theoretical discussions in my tripartite framework apply to the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically to the international allocation of vaccines? The current controversy relates to the problem of allocating vaccine among nations. The crux of the problem is two competing duties. States have jurisdictional duties to care for those under their jurisdiction, but states also have cosmopolitan duties to assist and care for the vulnerable populations of other nations in need. Those who defend protectionism and vaccine nationalism typically defend jurisdictional over and above cosmopolitan duty based on the criterion of community membership, such as citizenship or nationality. Those who defend the opposite view, called vaccine cosmopolitanism, will defend cosmopolitan duties to assist and care for the vulnerable populations of other nations based on the idea of need alone. The utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer in Princeton is an example of supporter of vaccine cosmopolitanism. So for him, community membership considerations are arbitrary and morally irrelevant. More moderate views of vaccine cosmopolitanism would be, for example, Ezekiel Emanuel and Arthur Kaplan, who defend fair global distribution of coronavirus vaccines while acknowledging the ethical justifications for some degree of national partiality. I would include myself in the more moderate group. So my tripartite account would never require states to prioritize caring for outsiders at the cost of neglecting vulnerable ones under their own jurisdiction. This would be contrary to the principle of subsidiarity. However, my account would require extraterritorial obligations to care for vulnerable outsiders when the state has the capacity to do so without abandoning its vulnerable fellow citizens and residents. And in this category of residents, I'm including migrants, refugees, and internally dispersed persons. Both solidarity and stewardship would so require. But how would I balance these two obligations, given the reality that the initial supply of coronavirus vaccine is scarce and the global demand cannot be realistically met? I would first define a spectrum of vulnerability, both domestically and across global populations, to identify where the global and the domestic priorities should lie. So the most vulnerable populations to which priority should prima facie be given would include, for example, the elderly in nursing homes, those with comorbidities and with a compromised immune system, the homeless, the incarcerated populations, and those living in shelters or homes where social distancing is a real challenge, as well as essential workers, including here frontline healthcare and supply chain workers. So call them priority group number one, composed of fundamentally of those who were hit the hardest during the pandemic in every country. This group would typically coincide with racial minorities in most countries. All members of priority group number one in all nations should be, in principle, and other things being equal, vaccinated before members of priority group number two gets the vaccine, first domestically and then internationally. Group two would include, for example, healthcare professionals in general and other less vulnerable populations. High-income countries such as US and Canada seem to have the economic capacity to vaccinate their priority group number ones, two, three, 4, and beyond, since the vaccine is now being offered, depending on the country, depending on the state, and depending on the province, even to those who are the least vulnerable, such as fit, wealthy, white-collar workers, and others who can work remotely from the comfort of their homes and do not depend on subsistence incomes. Some would contend that this is an example of vaccine nationalism. If the lack of coordination with foreign countries proves to be true, then my love-based account would challenge this allocation policy. If solidarity in the context of pandemics justify duties of mutual care among nations based on their mutual vulnerability to epidemics, and if solidarity justifies extraterritorial obligations to care for and assist outsiders when the state has the capacity to help, even when it's costly and inconvenient to do so, then solidarity would require high-income countries like the US and Canada and perhaps the UK to vaccinate all members of their priority group number one and then allocate the surplus to members of priority group number one in other countries so that all the most vulnerable global populations can receive the vaccine as soon as possible. Solidarity would also require that the least vulnerable in these countries, the US and Canada, continue to sacrifice by wearing masks and respecting selective lockdown measures when necessary, for example, in the name of the global common good, until all most vulnerable populations in all countries have been vaccinated. Yes, love does require some degree of self-sacrifice for the good of others, especially those in more urgent need. My proposal here is consistent with the principle of subsidiarity, since the care for the most vulnerable outsiders is not neglecting the national population. The most vulnerable citizens and residents are cared for first. But subsidiarity is to be read in consonance with solidarity, multilateralism, and a global co-responsibility of care in the face of common threats. Subsidiarity would not validate claims of self-sufficiency or extreme protectionism or extreme nationalism that would entail the abandonment and exclusion of the most vulnerable in other countries. Now, this bottom-up approach to multilateralism that subsidiarity justifies necessitates a coordinated interaction between higher and lower level communities, internationally and locally. This global co-responsibility of care that I'm proposing requires, therefore, effective communication among all these stakeholders. Here's where the principle of stewardship, I think, is helpful to specify the other two principles. A key element of the steward's duty of care is truthful, evidence-based, consistent, and timely shared communication, not only among stakeholders, but also with those under their leadership, like us. Without this kind of communication, there can be no trust in these relationships of care. Stewardship requires public health authorities, both at the international and national levels, to communicate their allocation plans transparently, explaining, for example, accurately the spectrum of vulnerabilities, the different priority groups in their own countries and globally, combined with a realistic timeline for each group to receive the vaccine. Populations are respected when they are truthfully and timely informed, not only of a clear vaccination plan within their territory, but also educated about the vital importance of multilateral collaboration with other nations for an effective pandemic suppression. Obviously, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, this kind of communication has been lacking. This resulted in the erosion of public trust in health authorities in general. And this erosion led to further polarization, disunion, and general backlash against cooperation at all levels of community. But the language of love and its three principles may restore union in community. One way love can move things forward is by establishing common ground between opposing views such as vaccine cosmopolitanism and vaccine nationalism. And the identification of this common ground through my tripartite account was the main finding of this chapter 3. So from the examination of what is international cooperation, why is it a legal duty, and what does it entail in the current COVID-19 vaccination context, I show that states have a legal duty to cooperate during a pandemic when they have the capacity to do so. And while this duty entails an extraterritorial responsibility to care for and assist other nations, this legal duty also requires states to attend first to the basic needs of those most vulnerable under their own jurisdiction. The upshot of my conceptual and normative analysis was a tripartite account of pandemic governance based on the principles of solidarity, stewardship, and subsidiarity. This tripartite account opened a creative way of theorizing a long-standing debate in the ethics and global affairs literature, namely the moral tension between multilateralism and protectionism, which Pope Francis in his recent remarks at the UN has reminded us about. My account substantiates this idea of global co-responsibilities for international cooperation, not only in the specific context of a pandemic examined here, but also beyond, as an ethic of love of neighbor would justify. My future research and the next chapters of the book will be looking at the ways in which love and its three principles would justify some radical changes in the practice of global affairs in general, and the design and the funding of global health institutions such as the WHO in particular. It will argue that to be a better global leader, the WHO should do less and have a much narrower mandate. Love and its three principles would so require. Specifically, I'll argue that WHO should focus exclusively on global coordination efforts by ensuring truthful, evidence-based, consistent, and timely shared communications regarding public health emergencies of international concern among member states and other stakeholders, and delegate all the rest of WHO's ambitious mandate, power, and resources to other stakeholders, better placed to deliver them with more participation of local communities and towards the ideal of integral human development. So to conclude, my book overall argues that if love and global affairs are put together, love would change the practice of global affairs in general and the design of global health institutions in particular. Today, I shared with you chapter 3, where I show how love would change the way we understand global responsibilities of mutual care. Although many would think that it requires equality of care, I show that it doesn't. Instead, it requires equity, shared yet differentiated duties to care for those in need according to our relationship to them, as well as their need. So love tolerates and even justifies some partiality by community-embedded responsibilities to take care first of one's own without abandoning outsiders to their own luck, because love is the opposite of abandonment. To love is to be present, to accompany those who suffer and be there for them in their need. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Thana. If you have any questions about that, if you that are bubbling up, do put them in the chat at this point, even though we won't have a chance to have questions for the moment. But just so that there is so we might have some capital in the bank, as it were. But now I pass directly over to Xavier to give a response.
Thanks very much, David. I'll just share my. Great. Thanks so much, Thana, for that presentation. And it's a real delight to be able to present to the Anscombe Centre Bioethics webinar. I have visited Oxford several times before, and I was a visiting scholar, as David pointed out, last year, and I had to unfortunately leave in rather dramatic circumstances as the pandemic worsened, and but it's just a real delight to be able to continue my association with the centre, and also to present a response to Thana's immensely erudite and I think informative presentation on how we might think through some of these questions about the global framework with which we should understand the ethics of vaccine allocation. So I'm just going to, first of all, just to try and very briefly summarize the main messages I took from Thana's presentation, and also I plan to present just a few questions that I think might be a stimulus for further discussion, and maybe a kind of aspects of a global framework that sort of often present challenges, I think, when we're thinking through the ethics of global vaccine allocation. So in this presentation, 3 questions have been addressed. We considered what international cooperation is, why it's a legal duty, what it entails in the current COVID-19 context. So the presentation also considered whether a love-based cosmopolitan duty of care that nations have for other nations and that individuals have for other individuals necessitate equality of care and concern for all neighbours. Do we need to treat all nations and all individuals equally, or is there another way of thinking about this? And I think Thana provided a very good way of understanding the difference between equality and equity, and also the difference between respect and care and concern, and what that might mean for nations in terms of having a degree of partiality for their own citizens. The presentation also argued that states have a legal duty to cooperate during a pandemic as solidarity requires, and while this duty entails an extraterritorial responsibility to care for and assist other nations, as stewardship requires, the legal duty to cooperate also allows states to attend first to the basic needs of those most vulnerable under their own jurisdiction. It offered a tripartite account of pandemic governance focused on the principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and stewardship, which I found it very informative to see how these principles are both principles of Catholic social teaching as well as international law and justice. And I think that is something that the framework of Catholic social teaching has to offer in the context of this discussion, that the principles that underpin that framework are also principles that have immense currency in discussions of international policy, and can, in a sense, provide a middle way between the extremes of something like vaccine nationalism and vaccine cosmopolitanism. So I just wanted to focus a bit on the actual practical proposal that came at the end of the presentation, because I think this is an important thing to consider. What in practice does a framework like the framework of agapic love and friendship between nation states mean for the allocation of vaccines? And the proposal in the presentation suggested that we should define a spectrum of vulnerability, both domestically and across global populations, to identify where the domestic and global priorities should lie. So the idea of a spectrum of vulnerability is doing a lot of work. And for example, the most vulnerable populations to which priority should prima facie be given might include the elderly in care homes, those with comorbidities, those with compromised immune system, the homeless, those living in shelters or homes where social distancing is a challenge, and so on. And then finally, essential workers and healthcare workers. I thought that this was an interesting proposal. I've just got here the note that this might be called priority group number 1, and that the group typically, interestingly, coincides with racial minorities in most countries. But the idea that all members of priority group number 1 in all nations should be vaccinated before members of priority group number 2 get the vaccine. So say, for example, like healthcare workers who are not on the front line, or people who are under the age that we deem to be greatest risk, that they should receive less priority in their own countries than people of in other nations. So why do I think that this is a sort of a significant proposal to revisit and discuss? I would suggest that there are a number of questions we need to ask about whether we indeed should prioritise people who are most vulnerable in other nations over the general population in kind of developed nations, for example, because I think that is still quite a radical proposal in terms of the current kind of discourse on vaccines. I'm not saying it's necessarily ethically a radical proposal, but at least politically, it's a radical proposal. And often radical proposals are the best proposals because politics on a particular topic has become skewed by certain ideologies that we need to kind of challenge. But I would ask a question about how we ought to think about a spectrum of vulnerability. So first of all, I want to kind of look at whether we have more obligations in the area of vaccine cosmopolitanism, more obligations to other countries, and then I want to look at whether we have more obligations to our own citizens. So just on this question of our obligations to other nations, I thought that it's worth pointing out that need is not a binary concept, and particularly in the pandemic, there's so much going on that it's good to kind of clarify just what we understand by the concept of need when we're thinking about the allocation of vaccines. That need is a graded concept, and someone's needs may be more or less severe than others. Are people in other countries more in need of vaccines because of the state of their healthcare system, how widespread the virus is, the virulence of the viral variants that one finds in that particular jurisdiction? People in other countries may also be victims of existing injustices. Arguably, one would say this should be taken into account with questions of distributive justice. That's obviously a contentious claim, but it is something worth putting on the table that's in the literature. And one might question whether that should influence our vaccine allocation decisions. Thana's presentation relied heavily on the concept of friendship and specifically international relationships of friendship between nation states. Sometimes interesting that the moral language used in Catholic social teaching is stronger, where humanity is described as a family. And I've just got a quote there from an address by Pope Francis at Christmas time last year. So basically the idea is that there are bonds not just of friendship, but of sort of familial concern and regard that exist between the members of humanity, and that this has kind of practical implications for international policy. So a question I had is just like whether how much importance we is how much importance we ought to place on this concept of the human family, and whether the concept of the human family is consistent with a framework of friendship, and whether the notion of family gives rise to additional obligations of care and concern between nation states. So that's a sort of an open question, but sort of something that I thought was worth pointing out, because I think this can often be a source of tension when people are talking about the allocation of vaccines globally. And when people start using the language of the human family, it becomes difficult to see how kind of the concept of partiality can work within the concept of the family. And I think we need sort of a bit of nuance to the conceptual framework there. I think, as I mentioned, the presentation, all these considerations notwithstanding, has advanced a fairly radical proposal for vaccine allocation. And I suppose my worry is that Thana's presentation or position, I think it, like, as I mentioned, it has immense merit in my view, and I pretty much agree with the vast majority of the presentation, but I just fear that there is this challenge politically in developed nations of trying to make the case for a kind of agapic love between countries and our responsibilities to our neighbours. And I've just sort of used an Australian example there to evidence this. So the question is, how can we promote a greater sense of global love to address the narrow pragmatic perspective that many bring to this debate? And then just to finish, I would just sort of suggest that there's a regional dimension to friendship at the global level. Australia, for example, I would suggest, has specific responsibilities to its neighbours in the Pacific and perhaps even in Southeast Asia. I thought Thana's point about the WHO having a narrower mandate and functioning more like an instrument to facilitate the efforts of nations to assist each other was a fantastic observation. And I do wonder where the COVAX facility sits within Thana's framework. I think that it's something that is a mean between the two extremes of vaccine nationalism and vaccine cosmopolitanism that I think is a sort of a very good initiative. The trouble is we just have to see whether it's going to work effectively. Unfortunately, it's been subject to significant criticism in the past few months over inefficiencies and kind of sort of slow progress, but fingers crossed it does provide us with some way of ensuring that a framework like the one just advanced in this seminar can actually become a reality despite the complexities of the political climate in many developed nations. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much, Xavier. There was a lot there, and there were many questions there. There have also been some questions coming up in the chat, and I'd like to bring some people in. But first, Thana, if you'd just like to take whichever question of all those you found either most interesting or easiest to answer, and answer that, and then I'll start to bring some other people in.
Sure. Thank you, Xavier. Those were excellent questions. And as I said, this is really work in progress. So it's great to think with you on the complications and the difficulties of it. I really appreciate your first question, which is the need to define the spectrum of vulnerability. I agree that it's doing a lot of heavy work there. So I should spend more time thinking about it. And I think I'm trying to make it clear in my mind if things were all equal, what is in principle what would be in principle the things that we would have to do. Of course, things are not equal, right? And that's the complication that we just have to pay attention to. But if things were equal, then what would we have to do in principle? And that's how I I try to structure or think about this spectrum of vulnerability to begin with as a very basic first step. That's why I thought about maybe having who would be in the priority group number 1, who would be in the priority group number 2. But as I said, things are not equal. So of course there are things, many things that we would have to take into consideration. One of them would be the concept of need that you alluded to. For example, the concept of need itself has an objective interpretation. Basic needs are basic needs for everybody. But of course, there are subjective elements to that as well. So for example, the elderly group in different countries would be different depending on life expectancy or even structural questions of injustice that you also alluded to. So for example, I know that in the US, there has been some debates about who is the elderly and how to identify them. So the elderly within the white population would be 75 years old. For within the Black population, it's not 75, but 72. And then for the Latinos in the US, it's not 75, not 72, it's 67 years old. So all of this elements would have to come in the reasoning there of defining the spectrum of vulnerability, both domestically and globally. But I thought that if we have at the very least the basic principle clear, then perhaps identifying all these difficulties would be not be easier, but would be a way forward. Also, another complication is the fact that well, in my proposal, I said, well, everybody in the first group, in the priority group number 1, should be vaccinated across the board, right? Across political borders in all countries. But one of the complications in this pandemic is the fact that the poorest countries are less affected, which is something new compared to other pandemics that we had in the past, right? I think by and large, the most affected countries have been the more developed ones this time. Of course, there are exceptions there, including my home country, Brazil. But this is also something that needs to be considered when we define the spectrum of vulnerability.
Thank you very much. Could I just stop you, Thana? Only because I want to try to bring in some other people.
Sure.
There's a Verbum Day, so I don't know who Verbum Day is, but has asked actually 3 questions, which might be a bit too much, but I'm interested more in the first and the last one. One about efficiency and one about corruption. So would Verbum, whoever you are, Verbum Day, would you like to show yourself and ask the question?
Yes. Wait. Hi there. Yeah, I'm James. I'm using my community account. Thank you, Dr. Thana, and also Dr. Xavier for your reply. Yeah, I'm a Catholic priest. I was assigned in Philippines for the last 20 years or so. I'm just back in the UK now visiting my family. And my brother works on the vaccine program in the consultancy group that advises the NHS here on the distribution of the vaccine. So it's quite interesting to have perspective from Philippines and a perspective here in the UK. Yeah, if you meant just my first and third, well, the first one is really a comment. When you said the phrase, love requires generosity, not efficiency, I felt like when you come to consider a vaccine distribution program, it does need efficiency. And when I think of, this idea of, okay, now you finished the priority group 1, let's go to the priority group 1 of another country. Exactly how you're going to do that? Are you just going to drop off the vaccines at the port? Because, for example, Philippines has not even started vaccinating yet. It doesn't have an infrastructure. It's going to be technically and practically very, very difficult. So how would your proposal from PG1 in one country to another work? And shouldn't the government in the respective receiving country have some responsibility out of the very principle of subsidiarity, that they should be doing their best? And how would corruption enter into our arguments of loving our neighbor? Because love also has to be balanced with justice. Thank you.
And can I just to add something to the efficiency, because that was something that I was interested in, and it was in terms of the production of these in the first place, and also the place of, should we say, capitalism in this story, as well as solidarity. Where does that fit in terms of your three principles that you need to efficiently produce these things? And indeed, we've seen in the tensions between the UK and the EU, arguments which are, if anything, more about efficiency than they are anything else, although those lead to other kind of debates. So where does efficiency play? But also the points that was made about the Philippines very well by Father James.
Yeah, thank you, Father James. Those were excellent questions. So I agree with you. It's not that efficiency is not necessary at all, right? I think my point was, I think oftentimes in public policy, both domestically and internationally, it's all about efficiency, right? Decisions are made based on cost-benefit analysis, and that's all it takes to define what is just, what is unjust, what is required or not. And of course, there are practical decisions to be made, and efficiency is a very important component in how to make those practical decisions. But I think my point was just to question a little this utilitarian mindset where efficiency is everything and efficiency solves all the problems. I think that love, perhaps, and justice as well, if it's a non-utilitarian understanding of justice, would sometimes question whether efficiency is the way forward for everything, or is the only way to solve problems and to give the right answer. I agree with you that questions on the distribution of the vaccine, once the vaccine gets to the country, these are very complicated also, because the vaccine will probably need, depending on the vaccine, will probably need very specific ways to be stored, very complicated ways to be delivered and transported, and all these have to be carefully assessed. I think subsidiarity would require that the country that is bringing the vaccine in, and especially the country that is receiving, kind of collaborate in a way that makes the distribution effective, also efficient, but effective as well. Perhaps if the local population do not have the means to store, to transport the vaccination, and then to give the vaccines to the patients, maybe work in collaboration with other global stakeholders who are in a position to help them. But I agree with you that the primary responsibility is of the local, of the nation receiving the vaccine.
And Michael Wee, you have a question.
Hi, thank you very much. Thanks, Thana, for your excellent paper. I guess as a response to the COVID crisis, understood as a crisis of the disease, the coronavirus disease itself, I think I agree with a lot of what you say. I mean, there's some practical issues of the kind that Father James has just mentioned, but I agree with the principles and the way you talk about the application broadly. However, the COVID crisis is more than just a crisis of the disease. It's also a crisis of the effects of lockdowns and restrictions and economic recession and health, social, economic effects. Many of those you outline as being in priority group 1 for the virus, for the vaccine, are also those who are most vulnerable to those wider effects of the pandemic crisis as a whole. Now, if countries have to wait to vaccinate the less vulnerable to the disease, while other countries are proceeding with their vaccination of priority group 1 and such, that means that more people within their borders continue to suffer from those wider effects of the COVID crisis. Whereas if you allow nations to immunize most of their own first, maybe not 100%, but say 70 or 80% of their own first, before helping others, that could allow more states and regions to come out of lockdowns and restart their economies. And that is also a kind of, I think, a neglected form of solidarity with the vulnerable. So does that change the application of your account of love if we take this wider view of the global crisis?
Thank you, Michael. I'm not sure if it changes. As I said, I think the priority groups 1, 2, 3, the specifics of who is in each group would depend, I think, on the epidemiological and cultural realities of each country. So of course, if lockdowns are particularly hard on a population that would be in one country defined as group number 2, perhaps in a different country would be group number 1. I think it depends a little on the epidemiological realities of that country. However, I think what love would require from different countries would be to have an honest understanding of how perhaps how vital the lockdowns or the lack of lockdowns are. Of course, lockdowns are hard on most of us, including people like myself who can easily isolate and who can work remotely. It has social, economical, mental health aspects and effects that cannot be just dismissed. But I think love would question us to be honest and to be willing to sacrifice when sacrifice is possible as well. So when I am able to be in lockdown for a little bit longer so that the most vulnerable populations in neighboring countries can be vaccinated, I think love would require that as well, a little bit of self-sacrifice from my part.
Thank you. Did I have I thought, oh no, I don't. In which case I'll ask another question. We wouldn't have vaccines without big pharma. And big pharma has often been a kind of almost sort of bête noire in a lot of discussions about global power and so on. It's multinational, extremely large, extremely powerful multinational organizations who have produced these vaccines, and unusually in this case not for at least immediate profit. But this thing wouldn't exist without lots of other things about big pharma, about which some people are ambivalent, including about contracts and so on. So could you say something about how you're specifically in relation to vaccines and COVID-19, whether this means that should we say that we shouldn't be so hard on big pharma on other times if we're going to have to rely on them when we talk about them at this time?
Thank you, David. I think big pharmas have a bad reputation and I think the argument that most people against big pharmas make is the fact that they make a lot of money out of basic health needs of people, and there are a lot of studies proving how much they profit out of that, and there's a question there of fair price of those medications, and all of this I think are important questions. But I think I agree with you that in a way, research and development would not exist without them. And I think we should also acknowledge the fact that research and development is a costly, very uncertain process and long process. And pharmaceutical companies put a lot of effort to research and develop medication for the population. So of course they should be, I think, rewarded for their efforts. I think a different question, or perhaps a subsequent question, would be fair price. How much is fair for them to ask others to pay for that? And I think Aquinas would have interesting thoughts about that, about fair pricing and intellectual property or private property as well.
For which see your book, of course. There's a question from Tony Coyne.
Hi, David. Just looking at my question, it makes me sound a little bit like an unsavory character from a Dickens novel. But I think what I said is, isn't it? It was to a comment that you made, Thana, and I said, isn't it a slightly futile sacrifice if, as in the UK, the rollout of the vaccine is proceeding at such a pace that it will, that hopefully excess vaccines will be available to other countries in the very near future. It just seems like, the success of the UK marshalling, the whole mechanisms of the state, the NHS, the military in the rollout, it would seem slightly a bit of a dereliction of duty, sort of, to stop that and send vaccines to other countries where perhaps the systems of rollout there are not going to be as efficient as in the UK. But obviously being extremely sympathetic to the situation that particularly developing countries have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. I think I need to reflect a little bit more on how to balance those two, right? I think solidarity and subsidiarity in principle are very complementary, and I think they help us understand things. They're complicated in reality. When I mention about sacrifice, to my mind, it seems that love would justify some degree of sacrifice. Of course, I do understand that, the UK, in being efficient and in being good in taking care of its own population, is discharging its duty towards their citizens and everybody. So it's not that that is not to be taken into consideration, or that it doesn't matter at all. Of course it does. And I think the UK is doing what it's supposed to do, what other countries are supposed to be doing, but are not doing. I think my question is, if the pandemic is a global health problem that requires global coordination to be completely or to be effectively suppressed, I think the question is, do these countries like the UK, who are doing really well and who have managed very well to inoculate their own population, should they not be perhaps thinking about helping other countries who are not that efficient and not that effective? And if so, then how do we balance that? And if there is a duty for them, for the UK, for example, to help other countries who are not that efficient and effective, would it be justifiable for the UK population to self-sacrifice for those in other countries or not? I think these are the questions that I'm wrestling with right now, and that I thought that maybe, as I see love, or the definition of love, I would think that it would justify and require.
Thank you very much. Of course, an irony of the UK is also we have a very high death rate, one of the highest in the world. So in terms of what we're trying to address, the urgency of addressing it here is also, even on a global, would give reasons to do so. Though those would stop at a certain point. could I perhaps ask Xavier, because I haven't brought him in very much, to reflect on some of the questions you had for Thana, and say how you would answer one of them. If you take, say whichever you would like to take. Say
sure. Yeah, no, for sure. And that's right. And I mean, I should probably start by saying that I think there's immense merit in outlining a principled framework for allocation. I know that from like my own PhD thesis, and there are these kind of practical questions which are very sort of difficult to answer. But I think that doesn't take away from the merit of the framework. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize, like with Thana's research, is that having a framework which addresses this question of the tension between vaccine nationalism and vaccine cosmopolitanism is immensely valuable in and of itself, notwithstanding kind of these practical questions. So I don't mean to just sort of raise 101 questions and leave it at that. I think that I'd like to preface with that observation. But I think one interesting idea that I'd like to put forward is this question of what obligations we have to our regional neighbours. So, for example, what obligations might Australia have to its kind of neighbours in the Pacific, and whether that might be also a helpful way of thinking through this idea of subsidiarity, that there's kind of like these different levels of decision making, and that to some extent, like where we can focus on the more local level and try and empower people at that level to assist each other. Whether that's sort of a helpful way forward between this kind of dichotomy of sort of the global institutions like the WHO versus handling everything versus sort of nations just looking after themselves. So I don't know if you had any view on that, but yeah, that's sort of one helpful insight maybe. I think the other questions, I suppose, are just like these questions of kind of family and the different ways in which you can conceptualize the international community. I suppose they're just reflections that I've had reading through documents of the church on the responsibilities of kind of nations in the international kind of forum for each other. They're just questions that I had, which I think are often a source of tension when people kind of think about global responsibilities. So yeah, that's all I'd say there.
And of all of the most difficult to allocate resources, the most difficult is time, and we are almost out of time. I'd like to thank very much our speakers, Thana de Campos and Xavier Symons, representing not every continent, but a fair few between them, I think. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for your questions. There haven't been time to discuss all of these now. We're hoping to have a kind of virtual going to the pub afterwards, in the sense of some of us will stay on informally for a chat, and so if you're able to, you're welcome to. I'd like again to say, if you would like more information about the centre, then look at the website, or please sign up for our mailing list, and also that's the next event will be on the 25th of March. But with that, we are out of time. So if anybody, so thank you everybody for coming, and you can stay along afterwards. But I think we'll stop at this point and show our appreciation to our two speakers.